All right. Thank you everybody for joining us today for our second webinar, which is with Monika Jones, which is really an overview of IEPs for children with severe DEEs based for the US system and how that looks and some basics to understand. A couple of quick housekeeping things. We are going to be recording today and I've muted everybody and pretty much throughout we'll probably be asking people to stay on mute just so it doesn't interrupt the webinar. If you have questions, please use the chat function, which should be in the bar at the bottom of your screen. Also throughout, if you have specific thoughts about IEP follow-up questions or concerns specifically about the laws or the process or any of that around IEPs, please just write in the chat, because we are hoping to potentially do follow-up webinars on some more specific issues, given that this is just really an overview to help us. So with that, I'm just gonna go ahead and introduce you to Monika Jones, who is first and foremost a mother of a child who also has a DEE. And she started the Brain Recovery Project out of a passion of wanting to help more families. She's a lawyer by training, and so was able to dig in deep to learn as much as she could about this process, and now is here to share that with us. So thank you, Monika. Go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go to my slides really quickly. And I've got a lot of slides, everybody. So I think the best way to do this is for everybody to put down their pencils and pens and just listen, because you're going to be able to come back to this at some point. But what I have found in my experience, not only with my son and his challenges in terms of his IEP, but working with other families, is that most parents don't understand the IEP process. So I think it's really important for everyone to just try to get the gist of it first before we step into some of these other areas that we might do in future IEPs. Really quickly, I'm the founder of an organization that works with children who need or have had some type of brain surgery to stop seizures. I'm also a board member of the Council of Parent and Attorney Advocates, which is the only national organization that advocates for the educational civil rights of children with disabilities. But most importantly, just like all of you out there, I'm the parent of a child who has a developmental epileptic encephalopathy due to a history of drug-resistant seizures. The first thing I want to say to everybody is stop letting IEPs happen to you. So I hear people all the time saying, I went to this IEP meeting and the school did this, and I wasn't able to say this, and I felt like I was railroaded. You're letting IEPs happen to you instead of participating in them. And we're going to go through all these slides today so that you never feel like something just happened, something really bad just happened to you during that IEP meeting. Knowledge is power, and if you're going to advocate for something for your child, you must understand it. Today, we're going to learn about the IEP process only and just an overview. You're not going to learn everything today, so please don't come into this with an expectation that at the end of this hour, you're going to know everything about IEPs. They're very complicated. Today is just an overview. Please slow down. Stop jumping ahead. I have parents come to me saying, I don't understand why my child is in this type of placement, but their child wasn't properly assessed. IEPs are a process, so you need to slow down and go through the entire process every year. Again, you're not going to learn everything today. And then finally, whatever I teach you today, you have to understand that the entire system is broken. Everything isn't going to happen perfectly every year, because we're operating in a broken educational system for our children. If you want to try to fix this, we can talk about doing it at the state or federal level with your legislatures. We're not going to fix it today. So remember that part. All right, today, again, we're just going to learn about the IEP process. You, on a separate note, need to know about your child's disabilities, and you need to teach yourself about interventions and teaching strategies. Today, again, we're just going to learn about the IEP process. Before we start building your child's IEP, I want you to assume 4 things, and assume this every time you're building a child's IEP. Assume you're going to go to due process. Some of you call this a lawsuit. Technically, it's not a lawsuit. It's what we call an administrative hearing. But assume that at the end of the day, everything's going to go south and you're going to have to file due process against the school. You're going to have to file against them. Assume this every time you're drafting the IEP. Assume in that hearing that every member of the IEP team is going to testify against you, because I can promise you that they probably will. And assume that you're not going to be able to testify. I like to say, assume you can't say anything, because the hearing officer is going to be biased against you. So as you're building your child's IEP, I want you to think, I can't say anything, because everything has to come from the assessments and the other things that are in the IEP. Very quickly, what is the IDEA? The IDEA is the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It is passed by Congress, and then there are regulations that promulgate that federal law. There is case law that interprets that federal law, and then there are letters from the Office of Special Education. It's a federal agency that interprets those laws and regulations. Then you have your state's laws as well. So there's a lot of laws that apply here. Today, we're primarily going to talk about one law, and that's the federal law. Just know that the federal law is primarily what controls IEPs. Anytime the federal law is silent, or anytime the federal law says, I'm going to pass this off to the states for the states to decide, then you look at your own state's regulations. And in the DEEP website, we've already started to upload these federal laws. I strongly encourage you to get a binder and print all of them out. One of them is almost 400 pages long, so you might want to order that one and put them in a separate binder because you need to understand all these laws and regulations if you want to do this right. That's going to be on the DEEP website. We've already started ordering them or uploading them for you. Have any of you ever read the IDEA, the federal law? I can guarantee you that most of you probably have not. So we've uploaded that, and I strongly encourage you to read that law, because everything we're going to talk about is in there. It's all in there. The more you understand that law, the better you're going to be able to advocate for your child. And what's really important is the preamble to the law. Why do we even have an IDEA? Why do we even care about educating children with disabilities? Because Congress decided it was important. They talked about how disability is a natural part of the human process. We want to improve the educational results for children, ensure full parent participation, independent living, economic self-sufficiency for children, high expectations, access to the general ed curriculum to the maximum extent appropriate, meet developmental goals, productive and independent lives, maximum extent possible, and strengthening the role of parents in the process. This is in the preamble. This is the whole reason why we have this law. So anytime you're feeling frustrated, always remember that the whole reason we have the law in the first place is for these reasons, because as a society, we want these children to be better educated. There are 6 principles of the IDEA that you always need to remember. Number 1, your child is entitled to a free, appropriate education, not the best education, okay? So take that word out of your lexicon. Your child is not entitled to the best education. If you want the best education for your child, then send them to a special private school. The law is only supposed to give your child what's appropriate. Now, I can give you a hint. What's appropriate for one child may look like the best for another. So my son attended a private school that the district paid for, where the tuition was $75,000 a year. He is a totally nonverbal child who has pretty significant intellectual impairment. Is that the best education? Maybe for another kid, but for my son, it was what was appropriate. So that's why the district had to pay that tuition for him. You are also entitled to appropriate evaluation of your child. Extremely important. Circle this, stare at this word. We're going to keep repeating it all throughout this process. Your child is entitled to an individualized education plan that meets his or her unique needs. They're entitled to be educated in the least restrictive environment. You have a right to parental participation, and then the law sets out what's known as procedural safeguards. What does it look like, right? You go into an IEP meeting and you feel like it's a battle, don't you? That's what it feels like to me. So I'm going to give you your sword, all right, and your shield. Before we even start talking about IEPs, you need to understand your sword and your shield. And this is what Congress gave you as your right to ensure that you have full and meaningful participation in the IEP process. Number one, they have to provide you with what's known as a written explanation of your rights. You know that piece of paper at the beginning of the IEP meeting that the school says, do you want us to read you your rights? Does anyone say yes when they do that? Next time, say yes. Say, yes, I would like you to read me my procedural rights, because it's all laid out in there. These are your safeguards. This is what you exercise when there's a problem. Number two, you have a right to review your child's educational records. You just let them know, and they're supposed to let you see all the educational records. As an aside, there's also a separate law that says you have a right to have a complete copy of your child's educational records sent to you. So when you're starting to feel frustrated, something's not going right, ask to see your child's educational file, and number two, ask them to print it out and mail it to you. You have a right to consent before your child is evaluated. Not going to talk about that too much. You have a right to independent educational evaluations. Extremely important. Going to talk about that a lot today. You have a right to full parent participation. You have a right to receive what's known as prior written notice. Basically, almost any time the school says no, they have to give you what's called prior written notice. We're going to talk about that a bit. Dispute resolution. That's basically mediation or filing for due process. We won't talk about that today. You have a right to confidentiality, to have things presented to you in understandable language, and then what's known as stay put rights. Won't talk about those today. Prior notice. This is one of your most important procedural safeguards. So on the DEEP website, we've uploaded what's called a model prior written notice form that's on the federal government's Office of Special Education website. I actually print those out during my IEP meetings and have a stack on the side. And when the school doesn't do something, I write at the top of it and slide down the model form across. So anytime the school proposes to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or placement of your child, proposes to initiate or change the provision of free appropriate public education for your child, all these things are going to make sense to you by the end of this. So just listen. When they refuse or to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or placement of your child, or they refuse to initiate or change the provision of FAPE for your child, you have a right to prior written notice. Take the prior after prior written notice because it gets confusing. That just means before the thing actually happens, they have to let you know it's about to happen. When they give you prior written notice, it's a very, 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 very heavy burden for the school to meet. They have to describe the action they propose or refuse to do. They have to explain why they refuse or propose to do it. They have to describe every single procedure, assessment, record, or report they use to come to their decision. They have to tell you what options they weighed, and they have to describe the factors that they considered and why they rejected them. They have to give you a notice of your procedural safeguards, and then they have to tell you where you can find assistance to understand your rights under prior written notice. That is an extremely, extremely heavy burden for a school system to meet. So you should always ask them for prior written notice when they say no to something, because this causes them to step back and say, hold on a second, we haven't met all these things, and maybe we shouldn't be saying no just yet to what the parent has requested. So quickly, real world examples of this. You've asked for your child to be evaluated and then say no, they have to give you prior written notice. They want to change your child's identification. Let's say your child is orthopedic impairment. They want to change it to intellectual disability. They have to give you prior written notice. They refuse a particular placement for your child. You want your child in gen ed, they want your child in special education. They say no, they have to give you prior written notice. Suddenly they say your child's in the mild to moderate class, we're moving them to moderate to severe. They can't do that until they give you prior written notice, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it's a very, very effective sword for your child and when you're building the IEP process. So be very, very aware of your prior written notice rights. Okay, there are only 7 steps to the IEP process. Know these. We're going to talk about them a lot today. Number 1 is referral. Number 2 is evaluation. Number 3, identification. Number 4, this is when you're actually developing the IEP. Number 5 is placement. Number 6 is review and revise the IEP. And number 7 is reevaluate. Look at how much it happens before that actual IEP meeting. This is all extremely important. Step 1, referral. This is the easiest step for all of us because we have children who clearly need special education. You just understand that the school has a very stringent duty called child find. They must locate, identify, and evaluate every child in the district that has a disability. This is a heavy burden for them to meet. And evaluate here is extremely important. They have to evaluate every child. So when they're saying they're not going to evaluate your child, they have to identify that child. It's their federal duty to do so. Who can request an initial evaluation? The parent, state agency, teacher, etc. I believe all of us have children in special education, so I'm not going to worry about too much. We all meet this test, but if your child is not in special education for some reason, all you have to do is request an evaluation. Step 2, evaluation. Probably the most important part of the whole IEP process, so we're going to spend a lot of time here. The school has to comprehensively assess your child in all areas of suspected disability, and some of us have kids that have a lot of areas of suspected disability. If you disagree with their evaluation, you have a right to what's called an independent educational evaluation. We call that an IEE at district expense. This is where I like to say what mommy wants doesn't matter. And a lot of parents will go in, sorry, I'm a mom, so I'm going to say mommy, but I want my kid to do this, but I want my kid to be in placement, but I want my kid to be, 40 minutes in gen ed and then pulled out for this. Remember I said in the beginning that you couldn't talk during a hearing? What mommy wants doesn't matter. Everything has to come from those assessments. Now, listen, yes, what you want matters. You have a right to full parental participation. We're going to talk about a letter of parental concerns. But everything has to come from those assessments, because if you ever take this case to due process, the first thing the lawyer is going to say to you is, what did the assessments say? What did the assessments say about your child? The assessments are going to bring out the strengths and weaknesses of your child. And here is my neuropsychologist, that neuropsychological assessment is probably one of the most important assessments that can be done for our kids. When you start thinking about assessments, when you start thinking about the IEP, and make this a habit of yours, every year you want to sit down and put together what's called a letter of parental concerns. Before the evaluations, put them together so that the team knows what you're concerned about. But understand that every single thing that is a concern of yours must be addressed in the IEP meeting, in the IEP itself. The statute actually says that. Don't go out and write a 12-page letter of parental concerns. I know many of our children have a lot of things going on, and you're going to want to let the school know about everything. My son has multiple significant disabilities. My concerns for him are primarily around communication right now. So my letter of parental concerns is only 2 pages long and really lays out what I worry about for communication. We talked a little bit kind of when we were setting up this seminar about children that are deemed low functioning. I don't know what low functioning means. It's not in the statute anywhere. And I've met many of rare epilepsy advocates out there who describe their child as low functioning, and the kid is much higher functioning than my son. So I don't know what it means. So we're going to work on mild to moderate, severe, profound. I'm not sure. If your child has mild to moderate disabilities, reading is at the very top of that list. We're going to talk about that quite a bit because I think it is a myth that children with intellectual disability can learn how to read. So if your child is on the part of the scale where they can learn how to read, then I would move reading up to the top of the list. Pragmatics of conversation. Does your child have behavioral challenges, issues with socialization and friendship, and of course, independence in adulthood. Those of us with children that might be considered severely or profoundly disabled, again, of vague terms, I don't know exactly what that means. The evaluations have to tease that out. Reading still falls up there. So my son can't read, he can't decode, but he can recognize words on his assistive communication device that aren't, images. It's actually, if he sees the word hamburger, he knows how to press that to request a hamburger. Does that mean he's actually reading the word hamburger and decoding it? No. But hopefully at some point when he sees hamburger on a menu, he's going to be able to point at it. That's my hope. Communication. For those of us who have kids who are nonverbal, move that communication to the top of the list somehow, some way. They've got to be able to communicate their needs. Functioning skills, feeding, toileting, orientation and mobility if they're wheelchair users or if they ambulate with difficulty, figuring out how to orient and move themselves through their educational environment is important. So again, sit down, put together that letter, parental concerns letter, so you can figure out what's important to you this year for that IEP meeting. So what assessments are needed for kids with different brains? We all have kids with different brains, a lot of them. So you're going to want to have a comprehensive vision assessment it's going to include acuity. The school nurse can probably do that, but you're going to need a neuro-ophthalmologist. In my opinion, all of our kids should be followed by neuro-ophthalmology to look at ocular motor control, visual fields, visual processing. Some of our kids have what's commonly referred to as CVI, a cortical or cerebral vision impairment. I prefer neurological vision impairment because there are a lot of things that can cause this, but you want to understand whether they have a brain-based optical vision impairment as well. And then you need to understand how they use their vision, so what their functional vision is. And a teacher of the visually impaired and an orientation and mobility specialist, so that would be two separate assessors working on what's called a functional vision assessment. Auditory, can your kid hear? That would be acuity primarily, but also how they process sound. This is a tricky one because most central auditory processing assessments require children with at least an IQ of 80 to be able to participate in an auditory processing assessment. But those of us who have children with temporal lobe seizures, in our community, children who have had a temporal lobe removed for surgery, you're going to have auditory processing issues if you have malfunction of the temporal lobe, because that's where your brain hears. So it's very important to understand how your child hears and processes sound. You can also have what's called auditory evoked potentials, but that is something that would be done by a specialist, also to see how they do that, how they hear. Schools will typically say, "We don't do that here." I'm sure you've all heard that. That's not your problem. So if they don't do that here, then they have to contract with somebody who can do that. End of discussion there. So all you have to say is, all right, thanks for telling me that. Whom do you contract with in order to perform these assessments? If they refuse to do that, what are you going to do? You're going to give them what? You're going to ask for what? Prior written notice, right? If they say no. Orientation and mobility, that's done by the O&M specialist. You want your child assessed in static, dynamic, familiar, and unfamiliar environments, but it also should be done in conjunction with the vision, hearing, mobility, and mobility specialist, and as well as the school psychologist, because all these things overlap. How your child orients and moves in space is going to have a lot to do with their vision, and how they hear, how they move, and how their cognition. So make sure that that O&M assessment is done with all those other things in mind. Gross motor, we're all familiar with that. It's going to be strength, endurance, balance, and coordination. And then for those of us that have children that are more impacted, functional mobility, whether or not they ambulate, how they transfer from a wheelchair to a seat, or any kind of movement that they have at all would be assessed in a gross motor assessment, and that's typically done by the physical therapist. An occupational therapist is going to do fine motor, sensory processing, and activities of daily living. So they're going to look at strength, dexterity, coordination. Some of these things might also be done by the physical therapist. Visual and motor integration. They're also going to look at self-care. I'm always surprised when some parents say, well, I didn't know that the school could teach my kid how to toilet. Yeah, absolutely. That's a functional skill. So the occupational therapist is going to look at toileting, dressing, eating. My son is 13. He's still in diapers. The school has been able, though, to get him to go to the potty, number 2, in the afternoons. And that took a very long time. But for me, that was a huge gain for him to have us get him to the toilet when I can sense him starting to push, because now I don't have to change those poopy diapers in public. So school did a really terrific job for us on that. Speech and language. Some of your children can speak. So the speech therapist is going to work on assessing them for articulation, prosody, their intonation, how they stress words, pragmatics of conversation, very important, the give and take of conversation, the social aspects of conversation. And then you want to also understand their language. So that would be their expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, and language processing. Those of us who have children who are nonverbal or who have difficulty with words, saying words, my son is 100% nonverbal. So you want a very extensive augmentative assistive communication evaluation, because this would replace speech in their natural environment. And that in and of itself is a whole separate webinar. What would be the appropriate type of evaluation for a totally nonverbal child? But very important that you have a comprehensive one. Educational, again, I don't know what low functioning means. So some of you may have children who are described as low functioning, but maybe they're starting to sound out words, or maybe they're able to point to letters, or they know their alphabet now. Maybe some of them are starting to learn how to read. So the educational portion of the evaluation is going to look at reading, mathematics, writing, and then the other elements of learning, like, do they understand science or concepts of social studies, etc. Want to touch briefly upon the issue of whether a child with intellectual disability can learn how to read. This is a very outdated notion that they can't. And I'm very thankful to the Down syndrome community especially, who has funded just years and years of research to show that many of their children can learn how to read with intensive intervention. A paper came out a few years ago from Jill Allor. I'm very honored to call her my friend. And she has shown that even children with below average IQ, and in her paper, children with IQ as low as 40 did learn how to read with intensive instruction, and it took them about 1 to 4 academic years to get to about a 2nd grade level, but they could do it with intensive instruction. So those of you who have children with this IQ range that are possibly in the pre-literate phase, then you want them to have a very comprehensive reading evaluation to see whether they have pre-literacy skills, so that we can start teaching them how to read. A kid who cannot read by age is an emergency. I like to say a kid who can't read by age 8 is a child who's on fire. So if you have a child that has some pre-literate skills, move that way up to the top of your letter of parental concerns. Want the pre-literate, the literacy evaluation to look at their phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and then also get what's called the Lexile level, or some kind of benchmarking to see where they are in terms of their reading. So for Lexile, a 1st grader is about a level 280, a 5th grader is a level 920, and just so that you know, the Cat in the Hat is a level 260. So those evaluations should tease out where the child is in terms of their reading ability. The school will conduct what's called a psychological evaluation by their school psychologist. That's going to evaluate their general cognitive functioning. But if your kid has brain issues or having epilepsy, they need a neuropsychological assessment. Again, I don't know where your child is on the spectrum. It's very difficult to test my son by a neuropsychologist, but some of you may have children who can be assessed by a neuropsychologist. And the neuropsychologist is going to do a much more comprehensive evaluation than the school psychologist could ever do. And the school needs to pay for that neuropsychologist to perform that assessment. If the school says, we don't do that here, that is not your problem. They have to pay for that.
Monica, just I'm trying not to interrupt much, but a question did come in specifically about that, because somebody was told that their child is untestable due to being low functioning and nonverbal, so they have to do just a regular psych exam. So they're asking, how can they demand that a neuropsych assessment be done?
Well, you got to exercise one of your procedural safeguards. You can't force anyone to do anything, right? So if the school says no, they have to give you prior written notice. The other thing is you can also reject the evaluation by the school and ask for an independent educational evaluation. Let's slow down. Let's slow down. So you're jumping ahead a little bit here. So they're supposed to do a neuropsychological evaluation. Well, we're going to loop back around to IEEs in a moment. A lot of us have children with behavioral problems. School has to do a functional behavior assessment. These are typically very comprehensive. You want to define the behavior. When is it happening? When is it occurring? When is it not occurring? Then they have to come up with what's called a behavior intervention plan, which provides interventions for all those various different behaviors in various different settings. Again, this is a complete webinar on its own. Just know that if your child is having behavioral issues, you have to have a FBA. The evaluation has to test in all areas of suspected disability. A variety of assessment tools have to be used. It has to be informative. The person who's doing it has to be trained and know what they're doing. Technically sound instruments must be used, and it has to address the content of the child's individual education plan. Those evaluations can't be silent about what to do about your kid, and this happens a lot. We've evaluated your kid, but nobody's giving us interventions. By law, that assessment has to tell us what's supposed to go in the IEP. So when you're looking through them, you know, I always circle, what is the intervention that this person is suggesting for my child? And you get all the assessments back and you review them and you're missing one, right? Maybe it's the neuropsychological assessment, or maybe you're not happy with the vision assessment and you're not happy with the physical therapist assessment. If you disagree, you ask for an independent educational evaluation, and the school has to pay for that independent educational evaluation or file due process against you. We call that fund or file. How do you ask for an independent educational evaluation? It's very easy. You just say, I disagree with the school's evaluation and I request an independent evaluation. Do you have to tell them why you disagree? No, it is your right to just tell them, I disagree and I need an independent evaluation in the area of neuropsychology and in the area of PT or whatever it is that you disagree with. If you tell them why you need it, it does shorten the timeline down. So I typically will say, here's why I disagree, but remember I'm an attorney and I've been doing this for some time. So my letter that lays out why I disagree with the independent educational evaluation is going to look very different than what a layperson's letter looks like. So if you're not comfortable telling them why you disagree, all you have to say is I disagree. You have to either fund the evaluation or file due process against me. Don't get crazy. You know, if you get all the evaluations back, and you might want to disagree with all of them, but if you do that, the chances are really going to go up that the school is going to file due process against you. So take a moment to step back and look at the ones that are really important. I recently disagreed with the school's AAC evaluation for my son and got an IEE. Why? I was not happy for it, and so we had to pay out of pocket. For one parent once, the child had half his brain removed when he was very young. We disagreed with all of them. They were quite honestly quite bad. And the school agreed to all of them, including a neuropsychological evaluation, but that was a different situation. So here is one of those places where I would say, slow down, really think about what you truly disagree with. And then if you do, ask for an IEE in that area. Always request your assessments ahead of the IEP meeting. I hate it when you get railroaded and you walk into the IEP meeting and there's a stack of assessments like this. How on earth is any human being supposed to go through those assessments during that short IEP meeting? If that happens, if you don't get them ahead of time, what I will typically do is I look at my watch and I say, you know, got a lot of assessments here. We've only set aside 2 hours for this IEP meeting. So the first thing I would like to do is have everybody look at their watch and their calendars and tell me, when is the next time we could meet for part 2 of this IEP meeting? Because part 1 is just going to be us talking about assessments. The best practice for this is really to set up a separate meeting where you just go over the assessments and then do the IEP meeting subsequent to that. When you get those assessments, grab 2 highlighter pens, highlight all your child's needs in yellow or whatever color you use, and highlight all their strengths in a separate color. Your child's needs become the goals. Don't be afraid of those needs. If your child doesn't have any needs and they don't need an IEP, great. They can be in the gen ed curriculum. But all of us have kids with needs, and we want to know what those needs are so they can be addressed in the IEP. And then the school has to teach to their strengths. So those are very important to also highlight. And the needs and the strengths are going to go into what's called a present level statement at the beginning of the IEP, which we'll talk about shortly. This is just a quick spreadsheet that I'd like you all to start using. So you're going to start to list all your child's needs in the IEP in this spreadsheet, because eventually we're going to craft goals for all of those needs. Step 3, identification. Your child is identified to have one of the disabilities listed in the IDEA. Identification under the IDEA is very different than a medical diagnosis. Schools identify, doctors diagnose. Schools identify, doctors diagnose. Many of you have come to me and say, I don't understand. My kid was identified or was diagnosed with CVI. Why doesn't the school recognize that? Schools identify, doctors diagnose. So coming in with a prescription or with a letter from the doctor saying my kid has this diagnosis is not enough. The schools have to perform their own evaluations so that they can identify your child as having one of the disabilities listed under the IDEA. So they have to have at least one disability, they have to have a need for special education, and they also have to need related services under the IDEA. This is less of an issue for us. This is more of an issue for children who are higher functioning on the spectrum and typically get pushed into a 504. So I would hammer down on these different areas, but all of our kids need special ed and related services, so they would meet these requirements. What are the categories of disability? I don't see low functioning anywhere in this disability category. The disability categories, so take that phrase out of your lexicon for purposes of IDEA. Our children would typically fall under what's called multiple disabilities, right? I'm stuck. And this is what the IDEA says multiple disabilities mean. So they have impairments which cause them so that they cannot be accommodated in a class that's just for kids that have vision impairment or just for kids that have orthopedic impairment. My son definitely has multiple disabilities. Again, he has pretty severe intellectual disability. His first disability category is vision impairment, and his second disability category is orthopedic impairment. Why? Because the school gets extra funding if he's considered visually impaired, and the school gets extra funding if he's considered orthopedically impaired. The school does not get extra funding if he falls into the multiple disability category. IEPs are collaborative. They're a give and take. And for me, this is the give I give to the school. If you're going to get more funding, if my kid is VI and OHI, have at it. Great, let's categorize him as that, because what's important is as long as his needs are being met. So I personally don't care what the disability category is, as long as his needs are being met. So there we are. Step 3, we've identified the child. Step 4, develop the IEP. You've got that parental concerns letter, right? You sat down before that IEP meeting, you sat down before the evaluations, and you asked yourself what is important for the IEP this year. So the first thing I do is give the school team, I can do it in an email or do it in the beginning of the IEP meeting, is my parental concerns letter. Because again, everything that's in your parental concerns letter has to be addressed in that IEP. This is Henry's most recent IEP meeting. I'm kidding, but basically this is what it feels like, right? There are so many people in there. Don't be overwhelmed when you see a bunch of people in there. They're supposed to be there. You want those people there. Your child has a lot of needs. They need a lot of services and they need a lot of service providers. So when I walk in, the first thing I do is make sure that everybody who's supposed to be there is actually in there. Parents are supposed to be there. The child where appropriate, the regular ed teacher, the special education teacher, someone who can interpret the instructional implications of those evaluation results. There's a lot of evaluations that we typically go through. Somebody has to be able to interpret those for you. Otherwise, you can't fully participate in that IEP process. Somebody who, at your choice, has knowledge or special expertise about your child. If your child has Dravet, have somebody from the Dravet syndrome organization come in and talk about some issues about kids with Dravet. If your child has we have in our organization specialists who will come into an IEP meeting and talk about what removing half of a child's brain will do in terms of the educational implications. Most importantly, somebody with knowledge about district resources has to be in that meeting. That's the person that's basically going to write the check for the services. I don't know how many times parents have said to me that the school will say, I'm not sure we can do that. I need to call district office. No, they have to know right then in that IEP meeting whether or not they can provide a service for your child. So the first thing I ask is, who here has knowledge about the availability of district resources? Who has the power of yes and no? At a minimum, I let them be on the phone, right? Or available for a call, but they're supposed to be in the actual room with you. Very, very important. Okay, present levels of academic and achievement and functional performance. The beginning of that IEP meeting when they say how great your kid is and how cute he is and all that good stuff, that's fine. But the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance is the second most important part of that IEP. It's what your child can do today, right now, presently. It talks about how your child's disability affects involvement and progress in general education curriculum. And it also talks about their strengths and their weaknesses, extremely important. When you read that present level statement, does it pass what I call the stranger test? In other words, if you were to read that present level statement to somebody who has never met your child before, would they be able to say, oh yeah, I get it. I see what your kid is like. Most of them, probably not. So let's look at this kid, Joey. Joey started receiving specialized, this is his present level statement. Joey started receiving specialized instruction through blank in 2017. The data collected in 2018 during 3 sessions supports the growth, has demonstrated with support of his arm. It shows that he's, the progress he's made with his switch on his iPad. He averaged 43%. He's 22% verbal, 12% physical. I have no idea what this kid can do. I've never met Joey before. I have no idea from this present level statement what this child can or cannot do with this switch. So this present level statement is vague and needs to be rewritten. The present level statement holds up the rest of the IEP. How you make that present level statement really strong is with all those assessments, and then it holds up everything else. If you have a weak present level statement, then everything else above it is going to collapse. So it's extremely important that that's accurate and strong. So what's wrong with this present level statement? Henry is a happy and joyful child. He greets teachers and staff every day. He loves to play with his classmates. He can kick the ball, yada, yada, yada. This is my son's present level statements run once. He doesn't greet teachers and staff every day. He can't talk. He has no idea about other children. They're ghosts to him. He can't play catch. He can't run. And I would give my right arm if he could kick a ball. So why was this even in there? I'm wondering if it was cut and pasted from another child's IEP statement. So really have to look at that because it has to accurately describe your child. It has to talk about academic achievement. If your child has pre-literacy skills, it has to set out all those pre-literacy skills we talked about, their Lexile level, how they're doing in math, and their functional performance, their cognition, communication ability, speech, hearing, vision, gross motor, all of those things they were assessed on has to be in the present level statement. Look at your recent present level statement. If it's the same year after year, if it has test scores that are not self-explanatory, and you have to look at them and then go to a testing guide to see what it means. If it says your child is atypical or has this type of T score, or it says they're borderline or below average in something, all of these are very vague. Nobody reading this is going to know about your kid, and so this is not a good present level statement. You want to make sure those are not in there. Okay, we've written our present level statement. We know what our kids' needs are. Now you work on the goals. See how much you have to do before this, before we even start to think about goals. Those goals come from those needs and those assessments. Don't be afraid of the needs. But I do like to say that every need doesn't necessarily have to become a goal. Ask yourself, so what? Is this really a need I want to focus on this year, and focus on the most important ones? So going back to our spreadsheet, you're going to now start working on the goals here. What are your child's main needs? Going back again to your letter of parental concerns, what worries you? This year, almost all of my son's IEP goals are around communication. So the PT goals are around getting him to use one arm to hold up that iPad. The OT goals are getting him to use his fingers so he can manipulate the assistive communication device. The speech goals are around that iPad. He's got some functional skills, but you can see how my concerns are communication. Every service is woven around that communication need. He's got a lot of other needs, but right now for this year, the one that's freaking me out is his lack of ability to communicate. So that's what we're going to focus on. Goals have to be measurable. They have to be able to be reached in 1 year. And the Supreme Court has said that your child has the right to have challenging objectives. So make sure that you're challenging your child in those goals. They have to be academic as well as functional goals, and help your child make progress as best possible in the general education curriculum. Goals drive services. The more goals you have in a functional area, the more service and service time you get. Sometimes parents come to me and say, I only got 30 minutes of PT this week. Well, you've only got one PT goal, and you have a really bad PT assessment that says your kid's doing great, right? So if you really think your child needs more physical therapy services, then he's going to need a lot of PT goals, and that physical therapy evaluation has to reveal what his physical therapy needs are. Hope I'm doing okay on time here. Here's just your general IEP goal formula. We have 12 minutes. We'll do it. We can do it. I think you guys have seen this all over the internet, so you want to make sure that the goal has a time frame, that it's specific, that it's got the setting and the content, the accuracy, and what supports the child is going to need in order to meet those goals. So here's just a quick example I did. So this is a child who is totally nonverbal and is using an AAC for the first time. So a goal might read, and this probably still needs work. This probably still needs work. Each day during structured activities such as circle time with full assistance from the child's one-to-one dedicated aide, the child will request more on his communication device at least twice per preferred song, assuming they have a preferred song. All of our kids like some type of song that we sing to them usually, in 4 out of 5 consecutive days in a 1-week period as measured by teacher charting. You see how much detail is in this goal? It has to be very, very specific. So somebody who's never met your kid before has to be able to understand exactly what that goal means for them. We could talk about goals for hours. There are thousands of goal banks out there on the internet. Again, the goals have to come from those needs that are in the evaluation, and that therapist should be working with you on what the important goals are. So it would be totally impossible for us to go over every single goal during this session, and probably something, Gabby, that we can do in the future is like one session just on goals for nonverbal children starting to use an AAC device. Now you've got all your goals set out. Now you need to identify what the special education is that your child is going to get in school for that goal. What is special education? It's specially designed instruction at no cost to you to meet your child's unique needs. This instruction is conducted in the classroom, at home, in hospitals, or in an institution or other settings, and it also includes physical education. So exactly what is the teacher or the therapist going to do that is special for your child, that is different than what the gen ed kids get? That is the specially designed instruction. That needs to be laid out in the IEP. Quickly, physical education. These are all the different types of things that can be done for physical education: aquatics, dance, group games, intramural games, lifetime sports, adaptive PE. A lot of people say, oh, I didn't know dance. Yeah, if your kid needs dance in school, then they get dance. It can mean modifying classwork. It can mean a specific type of methodology. If your child is pre-literate, do they need intensive instruction like a Lindamood Bell program in order to get them to start to have better literacy skills? Then that's what has to be provided. Should they be taught in a quiet room? If they have visual issues, if they're very easily distracted, then that has to be done. So very, very special type of instruction for your kids. And then a lot of times we don't talk about this. Exactly what is it that the school is going to do? This has to be laid out in the IEP. What are the supplementary aids and services that your child needs to meet every single goal? These are typically things that are provided in regular education classes or in educational settings that will allow your child to be educated with non-disabled children. For a lot of us, that's a one-to-one aid. My son has had a dedicated one-to-one aid for many years. And so if that's what he needs to be educated in school, that's what he needs for page turning, that's what he needs for orientation and mobility, that's what he needs to get around in school, to draw his attention to his assistive communication device, to get his finger to point to the assistive communication device at all times, then that's what he gets. That's what would be under his supplementary aids and services. Just quickly, accommodations do not lower expectations. This would be a supplementary aid or service. These accommodations that our kids get, more timing, more time or scheduling, a particular type of setting, maybe books on tape or that kind of thing. Accommodations don't lower expectations. Modifications do lower expectations. I know so many of our children have pretty severe intellectual impairment. Just be careful of modifications. For those of you that have children, for example, that can learn how to read, have pre-literacy skills, don't let them dumb down the curriculum too much. Really start pushing for that literacy instruction. Now you've got your special education, you've got your supplementary aids and services. Now is when we start talking about the related services that your child will get in school. Look at all these related services that the law says your child might need. Does your kid need transportation, speech and language, audiology services, interpreting services, psychological services, PT, OT, recreation services, therapeutic recreation, orientation and mobility, social work, school nurse, counseling? If the school says, oh, your kid has cortical vision impairment, well, we need a diagnosis. Oh, you need a diagnosis? Okay, the school has to pay for you to go get that diagnosis. If they're requiring a diagnosis for something, then they have to pay for it. So an important slide, all of these services are available if your child has the need, that the goal is saying that they have to meet, and eventually needs a related service for it. Your child is supposed to make progress against their goals. The Supreme Court 2 years ago said minimal progress is not enough. It's got to be appropriate given the child's unique circumstances. I know that did not really clarify things much. All of our children are unique, but know that your child is supposed to make some progress that's appropriate for them. So really start thinking about what looks like progress for your kid. My son's progress is very slow, but he does make progress with appropriate intervention. The IEP has to state how your child's progress is going to be measured and when reports of progress are supposed to be made back to you. So it has to be at least as often as when the gen ed kids are getting their progress reports. For some things like reading, for example, you might want progress to be measured every 6 weeks so you can start to see how much the child is improving with intensive intervention if they're pre-literate. How do you monitor progress? That has to be in the IEP as well. And you monitor progress with Data, 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 data. You want the school to be collecting data on the progress that your child is making, and that has to be measured against the baseline data that's in your present levels. That data measurement has to be objective. Who's going to measure it and how is it going to be measured? I see so many subjective measurements, right? The teacher's going to chart it. I don't even know what that means. You have to make sure they have a rubric or some kind of checklist. Beware of goals that cannot be measured, like, oh, Henry was happy today, so we put it in our little tracking. We're tracking data because he was happy. You don't know when my son is really happy. You have to use some kind of measurement that's objective. Be very careful of these subjective assessments. This is another area that I think would be good for a separate webinar, is how to track data. There are a couple of really terrific advocates out there who could really help us with some good examples of this. The IEP has to have frequency, duration, and location of supports in it. And then now, at the end, after you've done all of this, now is when we talk about placement. You can't even know where your child should be properly placed until you've done all of these other things that we've talked about. There's a continuing of placements. Special education is a service. It is not a place. It's not a prepackaged class. So you first identify the services that your child needs, and then the school decides a placement where the child should receive their services. So many of us are afraid of a special school. My son has attended a special school at district expense. Tuition was $75,000 a year. That was the right placement for him. The law favors general education as much as possible, but for him, it was a special school that was really the place where he needed to be. Why? Because he needed intensive instruction on how to use that assistive communication device. Homebound may be the appropriate placement for your child if they have pretty significant medical needs, and these are defined differently in every state. But remember, we've already decided what services, what goals, and what needs your child has. The placement, the location is in the home, but it doesn't mean that all of these other services don't have to be provided there. They actually do, because that's what we decided ahead of time in the IEP meeting. And that's really it. That's really how to build the child's IEP. We can talk a little bit about mainstreaming. This is the test for mainstreaming. The law favors mainstreaming your child unless they're not getting any educational benefit from a regular classroom, or their behaviors, for example, greatly impact the other children in class, or the cost of an aid would far exceed what would be appropriate. Quickly, step 6, this is just you review the IEP at least annually. They have to do this with data from parents. You have to review whether their goals are being met. And I like to say, if goals aren't being met, you don't do away with the goal. You increase the services needed to meet that goal. Don't let them just move that goal off the table. Your child still isn't learning how to use that assistive communication device after 2 years. You need more services for them to use that device. Step 7, this is our triennial, right? This is when we reevaluate. But if your child has had a change in medical status, or let's say suddenly they have an increase in seizures, or suddenly they have an increase in their behaviors, or improvement in behaviors, all you have to do is ask for a reevaluation, and the school has to do it. So my son will have these bouts with hydrocephalus, and we ask for reevaluation, even though it's not the time, it's not a triennial. We ask for reevaluation at that time because he's changed. The hydrocephalus has affected him. So as long as it's not more than once a year, your child can be reevaluated. Remember how I said how important those evaluations are? So don't be afraid to ask for them. So this is the end. I'm sorry I kind of blew through this, but remember I said just to listen. Some great information here. Lisa Leitner is a friend of mine. She's also an epilepsy mom. She has a terrific website and a great Facebook group called A Day in Our Shoes. I strongly suggest that you join. Go to her website because she has great information. Your special education rights is a friend of mine, Jen Laviano, who is an attorney that has a terrific website that walks you through a lot of these things. If your child is nonverbal or using an assistive communication device, Practical AAC has both a website and a Facebook group for us. Kathleen Whitbread has done a ton of research and has a lot of information on children, teaching them how to read with intellectual disability. Every single state has what's called a protection and advocacy agency. You should familiarize yourself with that. The Council of Parent and Attorney Advocates, for only $50 a year, you can join. And then online, we have listservs for parents where you can get a ton of information. My webinars are organized there according to this outline of the 7 steps, and a bunch of other attorneys have stepped in to provide greater detail on these webinars. It's only $50, and I think it's a great buy. Parent Center Hub, yet another great website, and then of course your state's Parent Center. And it's 12:01, so we just barely made it in.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Monika. I think we did have a few questions come in. Those who need to drop are welcome to the slides, and the webinar will be up online within 48 hours for you to reference. And we'll be in touch with a feedback form that we hope people will share their thoughts on how today went and what future topics they'd be interested in. And all of these resources will be up on our website as well. We'll get them up. I'll share the link in the chat in just a second. But if you want to maybe take a couple minutes, Monika, there was a question from someone about, does this type of the prior written notice include changes to the daily schedule of the child, such as if they now leave the classroom for math when the child didn't move classrooms before?
So that would sound to me like a change of where the special education is being done. I would say probably yes. It's really tricky for me to answer these questions in the ether without really knowing the rest of the IEP, so I kind of hesitate to do so, but I would say generally yes.
Okay, sorry, I just was on mute there. All right, so the next question was about the neuropsych, excuse me, assessments. And it was, can the school treat a neuropsych assessment request that's been made as part of comprehensive reevaluation request as an IEE, circumventing the legal timelines for assessments under re-eval, and also putting it on the parent to find the provider to conduct the eval?
Okay, that's kind of confusing. So straight out the gate, if you need a neuropsychological assessment, they have to provide it. If they've done their comprehensive evaluation and it did not include a neuropsychological assessment, then you would ask for the neuropsych assessment in an IEE. They typically will give you a list of pre-approved neuropsychologists that they want you to use. You don't have to use their list of assessors. You can recommend your own, and they have to retain the one that you want so long as they meet the other requirements of the school. You can also bring in your own neuropsychological assessment. I would try not to do that too much because, so generally the schools only have to consider assessments, whether they're their own or whether they're outside. But it's really difficult for them to say, we conducted our own assessment and did not consider it. It's a little, and considered it and they really didn't. It's a little easier for them to do it when it's an outside assessment. So always try to get the assessment done through the school. Not sure if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
Okay.
We'll do one more that is, where does it? Well, there's one about how you can find someone who knows about your condition. If you're especially rural, the internet is probably your best friend in this case. I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
So remember, in order to ensure, the law favors full parental participation, number one. Number two, you have the right to have someone who has knowledge about your child in that IEP meeting. So I would reach out to whatever rare organization out there that has information about your child and ask them to Skype in or come into the IEP meeting virtually to help you there. I know it's tricky for those of us that have children with these really rare conditions, but sometimes some neuropsychologist or maybe even the executive director of a rare org could come in and kind of provide the team with information there. But yes, it's tricky in a rural area, but there's the internet now. You know, there's Wi-Fi everywhere. And I've done it many times where I've gone in via a Google Hangout or Skype into an IEP meeting.
Great. Yeah. And there's one last question about transitions. And I think that's really a big issue now. There's lots of stuff coming up. I know Child Neurology Foundation just put out some interesting resources around that. Do you have any other places to point to people dealing with that?
Yeah, I took out the transition slide on purpose because that's a whole other hour and two days of webinars. So transition assessment, the transition plan has to be in place by the time the child is 16. And transition assessments are just as comprehensive and broad as the ones we've been talking about and have to be in all of these various areas related to vocation, related to the child's strengths and weaknesses. We will be putting out a guide soon for our epilepsy surgery community. I think this is an area where I would like to start talking to Child Neurology Foundation and some others about weaving all of these things into the transition plan. But that transition plan is a very, very intense document that has to be put together. I'm happy to upload some of the transition information as well, but I purposely left it out because that's a whole other beast in and of itself.
Terrific. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Monika, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was really a fantastic and very action-packed introduction to IEPs. Like we said, you know, Monika has generously offered to do follow-up webinars. So I'll be sending out an assessment for feedback, like I mentioned. And in that space, I'll give a place for people to share their thoughts about what other IEPs, webinars on IEPs would be helpful as follow-ups. So thank you again, Monika. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll be in touch with more information about other upcoming webinars.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.